Yep. Hi everyone, so excited to be here today. In this talk I'm going to be speaking on supporting the well-being of autistic girls, guided by my own personal experience being on the autism spectrum. So I found out about that's me. So as you can tell, I was just born to be out in nature. I used to go around with bark and just play with the bark. Plants were much more interesting than people, sorry. I found out my diagnosis at 8, actually. I discovered it at my primary school in life skills class. I saw a sign up that had autism, and I thought about that word and I thought, And because I was part of this special life skills program full of autistic boys, I was the only non-boy there, and I got home and asked Mum, are they autistic? And she said yes. And I said, do I have autism then? And she said yes. And very honest, thanks Mum, love it. And so I didn't really think much more of it until about grade 6 and grade 7, the transition to high school and the troubles with friendship I started to have. My self-esteem started to decrease. That's when I learnt more about my anxiety, which often led to depression and that sort of thing. And I wanted to learn more about what my autism meant and who I was, essentially. And I started reading a lot of autobiographies by autistic people. Temple Grandin's a huge inspiration to me, and it's great to see that there are more autistic women now writing. I then met my autistic female mentors at the age of 13, one who's in the audience today, thanks Penny. And so I finally felt like I belonged to something, my tribe, and I think this is incredibly important when it comes to mental health. I actually asked one of my friends who's now going through the arduous process of getting a diagnosis what it felt like to not be diagnosed at a young age. And I want to put their insights up because I think it's so important to understand the power of diagnosis. I do believe that the sooner you learn the diagnosis, the better, because then we can learn to love ourselves. I had an understanding parent and benefited from knowing my autism from a young age. And what I've generally heard, as you've heard from the speakers this morning, the later diagnosed individuals, whilst it's a difficult process, they've generally felt a positivity of relief, and it's put their past into perspective, essentially. And then it opens up a community full of support and friendship and acceptance. Some of the messages to emphasise if you're wanting to tell your ladybug that they're on the spectrum is that we're not abnormal, our brains wired differently. Autism has existed throughout history, it's not something new. There are many individuals that have been key hallmarks in history that have helped keep the world going round, that have been on the spectrum most likely, and I think this is a comforting notion. We're not defective or broken, but unique and beautiful. Anxiety is a really big one. I actually found myself using some of the techniques today on myself. It's not something you grow out of, it's something that you continually manage. I think one of the best ways is to learn preferred methods of communication. It's not necessarily through speaking always, and it can change. Pretty much when I'm in a high state of anxiety, I can't talk, I go mute, and talking actually triggers me further. So what can really help is removing us from the stimulus, such as moving out of our space, encouraging us to go to our room, maybe get a drink of water, that sort of thing. And I usually then text my mum, email her, and then record my thoughts in my diary, which is really helpful when I put my thoughts down into writing. And let's see, where am I up to? And another thing that can be very anxiety-inducing for a lot of autistic individuals is unexpected situations. We don't like change, and we're often not. If we don't have tools in our toolbox to cope with change, then we can go to full-out meltdown and that sort of thing. And one of the things that I've learned about myself is it's not always obvious when I need help. So even today, it looked like I was pretty calm, but inside I was doing all my self-help techniques. And in the classroom, it may be assumed we don't need as much help because we don't present like the autistic boys do. And so there was a particular moment that I had with my mum when I was about 15, and I surprised her. We were getting to the point where I was getting pretty independent. I could catch public transport. I was pretty good. And she had to have this meeting at the staff school, and she said, okay, wait at the front. My friends will pick you up. I waited at the front. They didn't turn up. I waited more and more until it was 6 o'clock in the evening. Then it finally occurred to me, probably should ring my mum as it's about dinner time. And she said, why didn't you call me? Why didn't you do anything? I said, because you told me to wait there. So, just as she thought that I was getting the hang of it, surprised you again, Mum. So even now, I still need my action plans. I have my what-if situations. If I'm going somewhere new, I'll have a scenario planned out in my head. I have a phone a friend strategy, so I have a list of close people that I will go down my list. And it was good because I was with my autistic friends one day, and there was a fire drill, which is horrible. And I went down the list. I think I got down to number 5, and I finally got someone. And I rang Mum, said, it's okay, we got to number 5, it's all good. So it's really helpful having action plans and scenarios and talking it through with your child. Some of the great things that technology has brought us is assistive technology, especially when it comes to in the classroom. What I've often found, even with working with my mentees, is that they get very down because they're not keeping up in class, or with writing can be a big issue, especially with those with dysgraphia. And so one of the great things about computers is that typing's much quicker than writing. There's even things like dictation software, voice to text, and I'd greatly employ any educators in the room to let them use it. I found that from a young age, I've really benefited from guided meditation. I would focus on one sense at a time. I find that with a lot of meditation exercise out there, focuses on 3 senses at once, which to neurotypicals might be slowing down, but for us it's pretty normal. So we're already overwhelmed by all the senses. We don't need it amplified in a meditation exercise. So what I've found is, if I'm focusing on a sound, I'll close my eyes, and I found it's really good because it brings your emotions and anxiety down to a level you can start to observe them, and then, of course, build strategies from that. Even things like, if you have a favourite food, noticing its texture and taste, kind of like that scene in Ratatouille where he gets the strawberry and there's all these colours flying off it. That's what I've been doing recently as well. Introception, identifying emotions. Introception is the sense of your inner state of the body, being able to read your body, such as when you're hot, cold, hungry, and full. And it's also tracking your emotional state, which can be very tricky, especially if we're in varying states of depression or anxiety. So things like when you're sad, happy, angry, or ecstatic. And this is where I found focusing on outward signs to engage my emotional state's really helpful. So even in the car today, I was thinking, okay, my jaw's clenching, what does that mean? Okay, it means I'm anxious. Okay, what do I do? And then I worked through my signs and I became my ultimate observer. And they could be biting nails, jiggling legs, pacing, all that sort of thing. And from a young age, I benefited from using an emotions thermometer, which there's one there, but I had a simpler one when I was little, so it was like a 1 to 5 thermometer, but I found it was really helpful to have like a visual emotional tracker, if you like. And so over time, it's become more complex, and I've been able to use a 1 to 10, but I just find it's a really helpful visual that appeals to our strengths, and we're able to track it better too, which is great. Colour can also be a great way to represent emotions, so things like art therapy can be really powerful because if we're very visual and creative, this can be a great way to get our emotions down onto paper. And some strategies that I have developed to dealing with negative emotions and fixative thoughts, which are very damaging to our self-esteem, is giving it a time limit. So I say to myself, okay, I'm really anxious about this social situation that occurred or this event that happened. I'll give it a 10-minute time limit. I won't judge them. I won't try to suppress them. I'll just let them flow in. Then I go and do something enjoyable. And then if I'm still anxious afterwards, I can ask my close people for help and talk about what might have happened. So this is just one way that you can help deal with negative emotions. And it's also important that, and I find this with animals too, if you get them down to a low state where they're not highly anxious, especially with highly sensitive animals, if you don't give them strategies to deal with it, they actually can go into shock. So a lot of interesting work's been done in various rescue organisations, and what they've found is when they've gone into an area of peace, they've actually developed stomach ulcers and colic and things because they've finally released all these emotions but don't have any strategies to deal with them. And I think it's similar when you are dealing with autistic individuals, because we're also very sensitive and highly attuned too. So working out positive stimming or self-regulation, we all stim. It's just the degree to which we stim, which is different. So things like finger flicking, leg tapping. I'll often pace in my presentations, which helps me focus. Using our sensory toys, as Clem talked about before, using timeout. I had a very similar chill out pass in high school, and it was signed by my principal because I just found it too hard to ask for help verbally. It just was too much for me, and I used to get embarrassed and stuff. So it's a great way to just have a chill out pass, go to a designated space, have some chill out time. Walking out into nature, talking to animals, we're often great with animals, deep pressure, chew toys, and using communication cards as well is really great. My equine mentor created this amazing sort of infographic, if you like, that's called the Inner Tree, and the idea is that it tracks your different emotional states, so it's like, well, for all you Star Wars fans out there, it's like the light side versus the dark side. So you have, so yeah, it's cool because now I feel like a Jedi talking about it. But you have your shadow side and then your grace side, and the good thing about it is it shows me what negative emotions are. And if I'm starting to feel braced, for example, this will lead to shutdown. If I'm starting to feel panicked or anxious, it's going to have a major disassociation meltdown episode. Likewise, I can see what I should be feeling if I'm positive and well balanced. So you can make a more simpler one for your bud, but I just really like the way that she represented this. Self-esteem is one of the biggest issues I see in terms of mental health, and I think the role that we can play as parents and educators can really help us. One of the exercises that's very similar to what Michelle was talking about earlier is listing what you love about yourself, what you're proud of, your passions. It could be what you've improved on in the last few months or the last couple of years, achievements. And I think doing this as a family exercise or even with your close friends is really helpful, especially when you start to get into that fixative mode. So now what I say to my friends when they're getting that is I say, okay, what do you like about yourself? I'm going to start listing things, you go now. And it's actually helped us learn more about ourselves and also help identify when we get into those negative states. I think too, you've got to be really careful how you give feedback. You need to phrase it in a good way and give it context, because we find it very hard often to take critiques without taking it personally, especially if we value our work highly. So if it's in an area of passion or anything, the worst thing you can say to us is that, you're bad at it. Because that's how we'll interpret it, even if it's, if you need to give context to it. My art teacher was great like that. She never criticised me or said my methods were wrong. She phrased it something like, you can explore this area a bit further. However, I really like what you did with the brush technique. So I still felt good about myself, and I felt it's more an area of growth rather than something to be ashamed of. And I'm clumsy, so I just dropped my time timer. Told Mum I wouldn't do that, but there you go. Be specific. So don't just say things like you're so gifted or you're so talented. Say, I love the use of bright colours in your artwork. I like that particular dance routine. Otherwise, we may not know what you expect of us, and this could cause anxiety in itself. So just a food for thought there. Teen life, yay, not. I don't really know many autistic individuals that really enjoyed the transition from child to teen, I guess. And I just found my peers so unrelatable. Like, they were so weird. Overnight, everything became sexualized, and I didn't get it. They didn't like Disney anymore. What's with that? seriously, they started thinking about boys and friendships and rivalries and really just time-wasting stuff. So suffice to say, that didn't make me very popular. So unfortunately, quite a few autistic individuals are bullied. Around one survey and research suggested about 60% or 68%. And it's difficult for us because when we don't know why they're bullying, if we've got low self-esteem, we'll immediately think it's our fault. And this can be especially damaging because if we don't know the context behind it, we might just continue feeling down about ourselves. And I think another thing is girls bully differently to boys. So often a lot of the strategies that would be useful when dealing with a verbal or physical bullier does not help with girls because a lot of it's behind the scenes, it's kind of emotional, psychological, things like exclusion from groups and very confusing things that we can't relate to. And I think it's very important that we emphasise it's a problem with the bully, not the victim. Because we may not think this ourselves, even though it might seem intuitive to you. Emphasise to your child that it's not their fault and provide different perspectives. I think this is really, really key. One of the great things is that I use my special interest of horses to study human behaviour. So I started looking at horses and how they react to one another. And I came with an epiphany that the bullies are actually the most insecure individuals. The true leaders are actually the peaceful ones. So when I realised this, I thought, okay, I have to become a good leader. How do I become a good leader? And so there was this particular bully that I'll call her Claire, but anyway, my Italian friend was over at the time, and I came home crying. I said, I don't know why she's doing this to me. And I told her that this thing had happened where I'd been at school and I'd been walking past daydreaming. And she came up to me and went, and it was very traumatic for me because I didn't know what had happened. And she said, oh, so she's the super bra. And I just couldn't stop giggling because every time I walked past her, I just thought of super bra. And I love David Attenborough, so it reminded me of that moment where the gibbons show their red behinds, and it's like, I'm ready to mate. And so then when I realised that actually it was her problem, not mine, I started developing techniques to not ignore her, but show her I didn't really care. I think it's really important to find good friends, and these are often people who are neurodivergent. A lot of my friends are neurodivergent, and if they're not, I have diagnosed them. So it's really important to find friends with shared passions and special interests. Often, going to clubs during school is a great outlet because, you actually want to be there as opposed to normal classes where a lot of students are just put in there and don't really want to be there and that sort of thing. And I particularly found jazz club really empowering for me in learning things like collaboration. It really pushed me out of my comfort zone because jazz doesn't have any structure really. You have a couple of chords and you have a feeling, but there's no wrong notes and you make the wrong notes sound right. And for someone who was always fastidious in playing the right notes, it really made me more aware of another side of music. But it also showed me that I could actually collaborate with people. I started to tune into what other people were doing in music. Being part of a band was really great. And I actually made great friends there that I'm still in touch with today that I might not have met through it in other contexts. And I think the great thing about using our special interests and passions is that we can become quite social when people are talking about what we want to. We don't do small talk, we do long talk. So if we're a part of a club that, we can totally be ourselves in and just go mad with our special interests, suddenly we're the cool kids. We're the ones that know everything. I remember because my school that I went to was a bit different, and there was a boy who wanted to do physics in year 12. And so when he was only in year 8, or year 7, so obviously very bright. And I Makes me feel better. Um, and he apparently the kids said, the principal asked, how do you feel about this? And they said, oh, it's a bit weird. And he said, why? He said, he knows more than we do. So I think it can be really great having that outlet, special interest groups and that sort of thing. Yeah. How to start with this one? Floating's really confusing because it's not really logical, and I still don't get it. If you know how to describe it, please tell me. But I think navigating that world when there are so many complex signals and it's starting to change, we're already finding it hard to keep up as it is in high school. It can be really difficult, especially if we are able to discern intention, body language and tone separately, we'd probably be very good at it. But the problem is that we're trying to process it all at once, which is really tough. And not only that, people aren't always authentic. So often I'd start getting confused, and what I realised is that their body language was saying something completely different to what they were saying, and I didn't understand why. So I got this intuitive feeling, because I'm empathic, that they weren't really being honest. But yeah, so it can be very confusing. So I found that using my art and scenarios, so using the stick figures and thought bubbles, you don't have to be an artist to do this, and saying, what do you think happened, why did this happen, and that sort of thing. I also found spending time with animals was great because they showed me the complexities of social dynamics, but they're never really, they don't hide things the same as people. So they're actually, for me, a much more reliable source of information about body language and social dynamics, which I'll get into a bit later. Masking is probably one of the main reasons I believe that girls don't get picked up as easily, because we may outwardly appear fine, but we still need assistance in some areas. Often when we're, those who are diagnosed late have masked for so long that their friends assume their masks are who they are, which can make it even more difficult to disclose their autism as well as explain it to friends. I often get the comment that you don't look autistic. And I'm like, what am I supposed to look like, especially when you've been treated neurotypical your whole life and you're very good at becoming an actor of other people and mimicking, we may not feel comfortable asking for help because we're used to, being who people assume. My echolalia, I was echolalic as a child, so I mimicked speech patterns, made me a very good masker at primary school, but it started to unravel at secondary school because you can't just replicate speech patterns, and people got very confused at some of the things I used to say. I remember a really funny time when I was with my friend, and he said, oh, you and that boy, you seem to be on the raz. And I said, what does on the raz mean? He said, that you like him. I said, oh no, I'm like that with everybody. And then I realised, like a second later, I went, no, not like that. And then I realised that, I was friendly to everyone and people were interpreting it in a different way. I think exploring identity and helping them unmask is really important, especially when they might be going through issues with sexuality, if they might be gender fluid and that sort of thing. And I found things like role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons are really great. I mean, let's be honest, someone on the spectrum wrote that game. It's full of stats and numbers, and the great thing about it's very structured. And because we're actually great at being actors, putting on a character is quite easy for us and we can be quite good at it. And I think one of the great ways is that it's a safe space for us to be vulnerable. So for me, personally I've played the same Dungeons and Dragons character since I started. And it's really taught me a lot about myself and how other people think of me and, what are good dynamics, what's leadership and that sort of thing. And I think showing examples of individuals who are on the spectrum who are making change is really important, giving us specific examples if we don't have people in our life on the spectrum perhaps yet. I really related to Hermione and Luna Lovegood in Harry Potter, and Harry Potter became a great way for me to start learning about friendships and what that meant, because the great thing about books is they explain to you what the emotions are and they explain to you what they're going through, so we don't have to guess all the time. So it really helped me especially. And I'm still obsessed with Harry Potter, so... Yep. So disorganized, okay. A lot of us on the spectrum are very empathic, which means we pick up on the emotions of others quite easily. I can walk into a room and immediately feel anxious, my heart's racing, and I know it's not me. But the problem is if we don't have context on where the emotions are coming from, we might get confused and assume that they're our own emotions. So creating boundaries is really important for us to start separating ourselves from others. And the difficulty with reading others is it can attract people that can drain us. And this can create problems like, well, they're my friend, therefore, that's why they act that way. And this can make us be very vulnerable to becoming therapists for friends and not picking up on toxic situations. And often a lot of us want to change the world. A lot of us are social activists, and a lot of us may go into helping professions. And I think if they're more prone to helping people like that, it can be a good way for that to be a professional outlet as opposed to helping every single friend of yours. If the socialising tires the bug out, just stress to them that they're not a failure for taking time out. Doesn't mean that you're less of a person. We all need our own time, and self-care is as important like physical health is. And I think this is really important thing that I learnt, that your brain health is just as important as your body health because it's all connected. If we're not healthy up here, it will impact on here as well. Horses, again, as you can see, I'm an expert in weaving my special interest into everything. They actually taught me about how uncomfortable I actually felt with people pushing on my space. So things like if a horse, for example, came up to me, what they'll do as a show of dominance is that they'll push right past you. And I said to my equine mentor at the time, that makes me uncomfortable. And she said, why do you think that is? And I realised that they were pushing me out of my space and not respecting me, and I'd be pushed out. And I think what I took from that is that I need to assert my space, say this is my space and you must respect it, such as starting to stand my own ground. And I was able to translate this to words with people who were stepping on my toes. So that bully I mentioned before, I did very similar things to what very calm leader horses do. I just walked right past her, said, whatever, I'm okay, that's fine. I don't care what you do. And I think eventually it got me to a state where I actually started believing it. Because the great thing is when you start changing your body language, your intention changes as well. I think that's a really empowering thing. Some advice. I think, find your tribe. This is so important. Use tools for identifying emotions, so use stuff like an emotions thermometer, as I mentioned before. Look at outward signs to help your child pick up on their inner emotional state. Use passions and strengths as social opportunities through special interest clubs and societies. Dancing, art and jazz can really help with group work. I think involving their passions can create a positive space because often learning things like collaboration can be a traumatic process, and I think it's really important that we use their strengths to help do it in a positive way. And reframing things like, the fact that we can actually channel our sensitivities into positive ways. So my love of music, for example, I was able to channel into being a very good performer because what I found is that the adrenaline actually helps you keep on going, whereas the other musicians were struggling to keep on going. I was all hyped up and crazy, and it kept me going. So they were just sort of things that helped me realise that there's some amazing things about being on the spectrum, and it's something to be proud of. Definitely make use of positive solutions such as sensory aids, noise-cancelling headphones, tinted lenses or sunglasses, using mindfulness and sensory toys. Really helpful. I still carry them around with me today, and I just get out my fidgets, so I wear sensory jewellery and all sorts of things like that. So yeah, that's about it for me today. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to joining you at question time.